Thank you for joining us at tonight's panel, Towards a Better Future, an Interfaith Conversation. My name is Malka Simkovich, and I am the Director of Catholic Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I want to say a little bit about the genesis of this panel, and then I will introduce our speakers. 4 months into COVID-19 reaching the United States, the phrase, "we are living in unprecedented times," rings true more than ever, and yet perhaps feels trite and cliched. After all, some of our parents and grandparents have experienced other political and social crises which have led to mass casualties and societal upheaval, and it's hard to know how we will remember this period of time in 5, 10, and 15 years from now. But the nature of these particular times does indeed feel unique, perhaps in the sense that we are facing 2 major crises in our country at once, and dealing with 2 separate but interconnected fronts of crisis has given rise to important questions about how societal suffering intersects, who is most vulnerable to the suffering, and how we can do more to protect these vulnerable populations. Over the past couple of months, a number of Zoom events devoted to discussing these questions were organized, some of them featuring very high-profile academics, theologians, and community leaders. And I noticed that a disproportionate number of men participated in these events. On a personal level, this observation felt representative of my broader experience as a working mother living through this pandemic. Even with an involved husband and 4 relatively independent kids, I found myself struggling to complete my professional work, having been thrown into the role of a full-time learning facilitator essentially overnight. I'm sure many of you have seen the countless articles and conversations on social media about how, for a variety of reasons, this crisis is touching women in a way that has not yet been fully addressed. At the same time, these same women may be particularly equipped to cope with the national crisis in ways that we as a society have not yet fully tapped. I wanted to hear from women, and particularly from women of faith, about how they have experienced these past few months, both on a personal and on a professional level. And so tonight, I am so very proud to introduce you to a lineup of speakers that represent some of the finest thinkers and leaders among the Abrahamic religions in America today. In no particular order, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. C. Vanessa White, Associate Professor of Spirituality and Ministry at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Reverend Dr. Nicole Martin, Assistant Professor of Ministry and Leadership Development at Gordon Cromwell Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Mehnaz Afridi, Director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College in the Bronx. And finally, Maharat Rori Neiss, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. I want to begin by inviting each of you to introduce yourselves, and also want to ask you to speak briefly about something that you've learned over the past 4 months, which touches on your experience as a faith community leader. Perhaps we can begin alphabetically with Dr. Afridi. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. I cannot believe I'm sitting in this company of these wonderful women. Thank you so much, Malka and the Catholic Theological Union. I am really, really honored to be here. And I love the fact that you're bringing all women together, because this is what we need. And men, you are welcome, but it's all women talking today. That's the deal, okay? So I'm Mehnaz. I teach Islam and the Holocaust at Manhattan College, as well as directing the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. And I want to say that grassroots is not a flashy business to begin with. So there's a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of things to think about during this period. But what I really want to hone into is that the phenomena of religion has become more visible. The phenomena of religion has become more visible. Not only that, even if you're not from a faith community, the phenomena of meaning has become more visible. And I think we need to start there in terms of what this means for me, at least a woman of faith, a Muslim, and how I perhaps thought back to someone really that I've not been thinking about, is Karl Barth, who wrote in 1922 that we need a theology of crisis. A theology of crisis, which right now for me means to deal with the fear, the loss, the death, the uncertainty, the sick, and most of all, human communication. And the second thing I want to say, I know I have a few minutes, is a very important concept in Islam, in my tradition, which is sabr, patience. One of the things that we are told in the Quran and also by Prophet Muhammad is that patience in itself is a virtue. And this time period has asked of us of a real intense patience and a waiting in terms of reflection. And the other thing that I want to talk about, and I think this is very important, and I'm sure my other cohorts here will discuss, is solidarity. Tuqaffu. Solidarity, which in Islam is not just solidarity, holding hands, but solidarity comes from charity, zakat. And that's how we begin to sort of connect with each other, by giving oneself, by feeding one another, by holding one another in each other's churches, mosques, temples, etc. And the fourth thing that I think we have all faced, and especially myself as a Muslim American, is our Black brothers and sisters who have been dealing with the inequality, the stark reality and truth within my community, which has been very, very challenging, and outside of the community. So we have to address a lot of things on different levels. But I want to just quote one thing, and this is in the Hadith, which is the stories of Prophet Muhammad. And he says that if you hear about it, and he's talking about a plague, an outbreak of a plague in a land, do not go to it. If it breaks in your country, do not run away. And I think there's something very profound about the stark reality and the truth of how we experience the world and how we want to escape, but really facing truth through this plague, our COVID, and facing truth in terms of our racism and inequalities that have quelled for centuries on. And as a Muslim American, I know that my Black Muslim brothers and sisters are facing the same within our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if we can go on to Rori.
Thank you so much. It is just to echo my own appreciation for you, Malka, for organizing all of this, and for the incredible women to sit with all of you and to learn with all of you. It's really just a total honor. So my name is Rori Neiss. I serve, as you heard, as the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in St. Louis, Missouri. I am a Maharat. I am ordained clergy in the Orthodox Jewish tradition as a woman, which is its own interesting story. And moved to St. Louis to first work in a pulpit, and then about 5 years ago took over the JCRC, which is responsible for building relationships between the Jewish community and people of other faith, ethnic, civic, and political groups, with the belief that we are stronger when we are working in partnership together. And so our task is to build relationships and to then work together on issues that are impacting our region and our world at large. And so obviously you could imagine how this moment is impacting the work that we're doing. I think for me, I'm really thinking about a few things in this moment. And in some ways, I think it really comes down to, and I don't have eloquent language for it the way that Mehnaz has for hers, but to me, it feels just like this stripping away of all of, all that kind of had been right. Like we had spent all this time in our world with all of these covers. I don't really know other, just this feeling of like all the pretensions that we would put on, that suddenly I think we're finding ourselves realizing that really, they've all just been so meaningless. We were actually just talking as panelists before we got on, but I've been having so many conversations with people just thinking, like, we've sort of have bets on which one of us first is going to have a child walk in and maybe distract us. And in ways where, it used to be that you'd have to be sort of embarrassed by this, right? Like if you were working from home and a child came in, like that was, you had to pretend like we weren't working at home and we didn't have families and we didn't have other responsibilities. And I wonder if women feel this more potently, although I'm curious to hear from others on that, right? There's also this sense of like, we're supposed to be so deeply entrenched in our work. And now there's just this kind of smile that comes along with it, right? Like, of course my 5-year-old needs something, and how sweet that my 9-year-old came in to see if I wanted lunch or whatever it is, and so many of the pretenses that we had that we sort of realized, like, actually there's no reason why before this we couldn't act like we had families, right? Like there's really no reason why we couldn't recognize that all of us are balancing so many responsibilities at the same time. But I connect also those pretenses with, I think, a lot of other things that many people in our world like to pretend, right? We wanted to go through the world thinking that we had built structures based on equity. We wanted to believe that people had equal access to healthcare. Even as we knew that it wasn't true, we wanted to believe like those were the exceptions and not the rules. And I think for many of us that are deeply entrenched in work of fighting against discrimination or educating about the structures that contribute to discrimination, we know them to be so real, and yet we still go through a world in which we kind of operate with those assumptions. And I think those pretenses have also been completely stripped away, to the point where we can't even pretend and we can't act as if that's the world that we live in. And so I find we're suddenly left with this world that's sort of laid bare, right? Suddenly all of it, for good and for bad, we're no longer wasting time, because that's what it really felt like. There was so much energy on sort of this pretending. And now that we're no longer pretending, I think there's a huge opportunity and a demand on us of what do we do with this world now that we've gotten rid of all of the stuff that was just kind of getting in the way. And now that we're really seeing it for what it is, I think that there's a real call in terms of what we do next with that.
Wow, thanks. Nicole?
Thank you so much, Malka. And it is such an honor to be part of this panel. I am excited to learn from these amazing women, and I'm grateful that each of you has taken time to be part of this conversation as well. I'm Nicole Martin. I'm the Assistant Professor of Ministry and Leadership Development at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I also serve as the Executive Director of Trauma Healing at American Bible Society. And I've had a little time to process this question of what have I learned from this pandemic. And I think there are probably 3 categories that I would put them in. And I'm here as a Protestant Christian. And I think the first category for me is this redefining what it means to lean into suffering. So as a Christian, much of our narrative, much of our faith narrative is based on redefining and redeeming suffering of Jesus on the cross. And so much of this time, I think we spend a lot of our lives avoiding suffering, running away from things that are painful, trying to cushion our lives with other things, going to the movies or going out to eat, anything that would keep us from feeling too much of a depth of pain. But this quarantine season and all of the ripple effects of trauma have made me realize that there is value and there's merit in leaning into this suffering. And I say this even as a Black American, I feel personally like I've been journeying through this ripple effect of suffering. First, it was, of course, the quarantine. And then shortly thereafter, my grandmother passed after having been diagnosed with COVID-19. And then the trauma of having to go to a virtual funeral, and then George Floyd, and then Breonna Taylor, and then Ahmaud Arbery. And every single week, every day, there's someone else. And there's this constant feel of suffering. And at times it can feel quite overwhelming. I often wonder, is this really what it's supposed to be about? But I think about people like Howard Thurman, a very, very amazing theologian who listed suffering as a discipline of the spirit, that our togetherness in suffering actually draws us in solidarity with each other. I think of scriptures. I think of Philippians 3:10, where there's a sense that I want to know Christ in the fellowship of his sufferings. So I'm learning how not to avoid the suffering, but to lean into it, knowing that there is something great that can come from this for me personally, for my community, even for me as a believer, and for what it means to be part of this human race that's all suffering in different ways. The second area that stood out to me is this idea of listening for the soul. So I also am a mom. I have a 5 and a 7-year-old. They're quiet right now. It's making me nervous. My husband and I have been trying to navigate this season. You know, at first we were like all frustrated, like, okay, I won't have a meeting when you're having a meeting. And now there's no shame. The Kindle is raising my children this summer, and that's okay. but I'm learning how to listen for my soul, to listen to what God is saying to me. I have acknowledged that for the first, honestly, like 7 weeks, I was all about everything for everyone else. Are the kids okay? Is Mark okay? Is the job okay? And then slowly but surely I realized I wasn't okay. I didn't make room for myself. There was no margin. There was like I was taking meetings in the car just to get a breathing room. And I had to learn how to pay attention to my soul. And that's when I started like, okay, you know what? I need to get up early and go for a walk. I need to be attentive to what my soul needs so that I can be well for other people. And then the last thing I've learned through this time is what it means to lead from a larger story. And this for me is why this conversation right here is so important. I think prior to COVID-19, there was an understanding that my story, even my own communal story, was important. But in this season, the ability to link arms and to hear and learn from the stories of others gives me a brand new platform, but it also gives me a brand new responsibility. So when I show up in the room, I can't just show up as Nicole. I have to show up as maybe sometimes the only Black person, or the only woman, or the only person of color, or the only person of faith. So the more I can lean into the stories of others, the more I can lead faithfully and say, listen, I may not know Rori's story, but here's a story that she shared with me. And I think we need to bring that story into this narrative. And I think we need to pay attention to this. So this has given us a brand new opportunity to speak for those who may not be able to speak, to show up for people who may not be able to show up, and to really be in solidarity with one another in ways that maybe we weren't able to do before.
Wow, thank you so much. And Vanessa.
Good evening. I am grateful to the organizers of this event, particularly to you, Malka, for your vision in bringing us together at this time. And I'd like to share with you some of my ponderings over the past few months. As a Black Catholic womanist theological educator who teaches during the academic year at Catholic Theological Union and during the summers at Xavier University's Institute for Black Catholic Studies, I must first begin by recognizing and remembering 3 Catholic womanist activist theologians who have come before me and whose shoulders I stand on. They did the work and endured the pain so that I can speak to you this evening. So I acknowledge the work and mentorship of Sister Dr. Jamie T. Phelps, Dr. Diana Hayes, and Dr. M. Sean Copeland. I like to call them the Trinity. I am rooted in the Black Catholic spiritual tradition mirrored in the lives of Venerable Henriette DeLille, Mother Elizabeth Lange, Sister Thea Bowman, Julia Greeley, Venerable Augustus Tolton, and Pierre Toussaint. I also acknowledge my family of origin, my parents, Robert and Doris Jean, my brother and sister, Randy and Diane, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, and one very special aunt, my spiritual mentor, Sister Vivian Reed. Now, over the past months, our context of pandemic, protest, and police violence has been the subject of media attention and some reflections from the pulpit. The voices that have been largely minimized from this discourse has been the voices of Black Catholic women whose pain has been magnified as they witness the death of members of their families, the continued abuse of their sisters, and the systemic racism that has been embedded in our nation and in our church for over 400 years. As Time magazine recently reported, when Black women and girls like Ayanna Stanley Jones, Tanisha Anderson, Tatiana Jefferson, and Charlena Lyles are killed, it is often out of the public eye and does not make news. These martyrs of racism have left an indelible impact upon the Black community. Until recently, the pain of these events for the Black community was ignored or minimized in our media, in the political arena, and in religious discourse. As there has been a George Floyd, there has also been a Breonna Taylor, senselessly shot 8 times by police while sleeping. We are horrified while viewing the filming of George Floyd's murder, but do we realize that it was a 17-year-old young Black woman, Darnella Frazier, who filmed the police who killed him? What agony does she continue to endure from this event? As a Black Catholic, I am reminded that Catholic social teaching addresses the human dignity of the person. But in reality, the dignity of Black persons, Black women, Black transgendered, Black men, Black youth has been denied within the historical context of our national discourse and policies. It is even more devastating to our community when our Catholic Church leaders, primarily our U.S. bishops, ignore the pain and terror that many Black members within the church are experiencing in light of the pandemic and police violence against Black bodies. We proclaim to be pro-life, but the lives of Black youth, men, and women are largely overlooked as we continue to bury our dead. I have within me a rage that I am just now beginning to recognize and articulate. I have journeyed for many years to disassociate myself from this rage. Seen at times as too emotional or coming on too strong, I began to find ways to cope with this rage through creative means and by keeping busy. I recently came upon a book by Black feminist Brittany Cooper entitled Eloquent Rage. A Black feminist discovers her superpower. And upon completion of the book, I had this aha moment. It was because of the rage of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, Harriet Thompson, Sister Pat Haley, and many other raging women who would not and could not close an eye to the racial injustices of their time that I'm able to talk with you tonight. The journey in the spiritual life is one of movement towards authenticity, love, and acceptance of self. I realize that as a theological educator, I am called to use my eloquent rage in my classroom in focusing light on injustices wherever they may be found. As Ida B. Wells states, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. The truth is that our nation and our Catholic Church in the United States have benefited from the terrorism caused by racism. The politics of fear have been effective in keeping people of color oppressed in their daily secular and religious lives. The recent dismantling of Confederate statues that is currently one of the focuses of our national discourse. The controversy over St. Junipero Serra's canonization shed a light on the fact that people of color's pain and terror have long been ignored within our nation and church so that our current white male system can remain in power. Rather, white people's fear has been acknowledged as a real and present danger. As the late, great Toni Morrison wrote in 2016 in an essay, Make America White Again, I quote, "So scary are the consequences of a collapse of white privilege that many Americans have flocked to a political platform that supports and translates violence against the defenseless as strength," end quote. I am currently teaching at Xavier University of Louisiana's Institute for Black Catholic Studies. Xavier University is the only historically Black and Catholic institution of higher education in the nation. Every summer, our institute, the IBCS, provides education and training for those persons of faith from diverse communities who wish to learn more about being authentically Black and truly Catholic, but also hope to develop skills to work in their communities. I am currently teaching 12 students who are hungry to learn about Black culture in the context of spirituality. In the midst of schools closing in the Black community, shuttering of parishes, economic insecurity, and chaos caused by this pandemic, the high percentage of Black and brown persons contacting COVID-19, the inequality of healthcare access, the increases in unemployment, homelessness, mass incarceration, and so much more, we are even more in need of a place such as IBCS that educates and trains women and men to respond to the signs of the times in the context of the Black Catholic community, and that reminds all of us that Black Catholic lives truly matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was really powerful. Wow, I'm processing all of this, and just one impression that I have is that I'm intrigued by what you're saying in light of going back to Mehnaz's first comment, that we really need to cultivate a theology of crisis. And what I'm hearing from all of your comments in various ways through different words, such as crisis and suffering and pain, and even in Vanessa's very powerful, eloquent way, torture, all of these words, I think, when we put them all together, I think that, I guess the question is, how do we put these ideas, these words into conversation with our particular experiences of faith? So I guess I want to pose the question back to all of you. I'd like to hear more about how you think your particular faith informs the way that you approach suffering. As a Jew, I have my own approach, which I wouldn't even say is representative of the Jewish way, because I don't believe that there is one Jewish approach to suffering, but I would guess that my approach to suffering might be different than someone who's brought up in the Protestant or Catholic or maybe Muslim community. So I want to ask the question to the panel: how do you think your particular faith experience informs the way that you might cultivate as Mehnaz said, a theology of crisis? And I'm not asking this to a specific person on the panel, but opening it up to any one of you who wants to jump in. Mehnaz, please.
Yeah, I just want to say, Inna al-insana la fi qusra, which means that God is saying that all human beings are at a loss to begin with. So suffering is not something that we experience. It's perhaps something we recognize. It's something perhaps we feel along the way in our path of life. Suffering in the Muslim tradition is very different to the suffering in the Christian tradition, both Catholic and Protestant, because it's not connected with God. It's connected with the human condition itself. So that's why, I would say, like, redemption is very different, salvation is very different in the Muslim tradition. But what I want to say about this notion of suffering is that it's the conditionality of being human. It's the existential notion of being human, because the human being is so small and realizes perchance that there is pain and suffering, right? So if we were Buddhists, we wouldn't even be addressing that, really, because that is really the process of how we're thinking about the self, the other, and the breaking notion of the self, totally. And what I mean by the theology of crisis is that, and just to come down to the grassroots kind of work, is that, many of us lost people during COVID. And Nicole, I am so sorry about your grandmother. My condolences to you and my love to you and your family. But a lot of us didn't get to bury them. We couldn't say the Fatiha with Muslim bodies. We couldn't get together and hold each other and cry upon each other's shoulders. We had to deal with a loss that was very estranging and very, very hard. So a lot of the suffering was very individual in a way, right? So certain communities suffer together. Certain communities come together in the time of suffering and pain. But here you have mothers and daughters who couldn't see each other and that were hospitalized. You have people who are in the hospital right now that are too sick that you can't go see. You see videos of people who are, calling in FaceTime at the last minute to say goodbye to a parent. So that kind of suffering is really about mortality, but it asks us, people of faith, what does this mean in terms of your faith in God and the world, right? What does it mean essentially to us as human beings, whether we are Muslims or Hindus or Jews or Christians? It's an existential crisis that we have to go through, right? So this is a trembling, a fear. I sound Kierkegaardian now, a Protestant theologian. But what I'm trying to get at is this core of a crisis that we were not prepared for. And perhaps we might want to say, we might think of a post-theology crisis, right? In terms of post-suffering crisis. So how do we get people together again? How do we hold them again? So I think that is really important in all traditions, but in different ways of how we understand suffering and what we do with that suffering within our communities. We couldn't have Ramadan. We couldn't really get together at the most joyous season of our month for Muslims. So we had virtual prayers. We had people reaching out to each other and looking at each other and having iftar, the breaking of the fast, through a Zoom call. So these are accommodations we made, but we always wanted human contact. You know, it was amazing to me because one of the things I just want to say anecdotally is we are all busy, right? We're all busy. I'm an academic, there are academics here, there are, community workers, I'm also a director, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter. There's so many roles that I play along the way. I'm a colleague, I'm a friend. But yet, all throughout the time pre-COVID, we were too busy to see each other. And all of a sudden, we're like, wait, I really want to see you. And that in itself is kind of a marvel and wonder in terms of human contact, right? We may say we're too busy, but yet where we suffer the most is that we cannot have contact.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Mehnaz. I think one of the things that all of our traditions share in common, and this is, I believe, one of the greatest gifts that people of faith can offer in times like these, is the gift of lament. All of our traditions have deep rituals and psalms and liturgical traditions of what it means to cry out, to be in anguish, to be in pain. And that language of lament, I think, can be a gift to many people who don't quite know what to do with this. And I think the deepest grieving that I have is not being able to grieve in community. So you said it, it's like, I just didn't realize how important it was to be with someone in loss until I couldn't be there. I didn't realize that when I'm there, I don't have to have words. All I can do is put a hand on someone's back or make eye contact or just sit silently with someone, and that was enough. But to be on a Zoom call or to make a phone call or to not be there, I have friends who have loved ones in the hospital, and the grieving is not just that their loved one is in pain, is that they can't be there. And in the Christian tradition, there is a certain embodiment that comes with the gospel. There is a Christ within us. There's a sense of like, when we get together, where 2 or 3 are gathered, God is in the midst. So there is this isolation feels even more strange. It feels like a spiritual isolation in some ways. But at the exact same time, it does force us to the people that have been with us the whole time. So, we're part of a very large church community. And during the first couple of weeks, we were like, my husband and I were like, we'll just do home church. And now our children love home church. They love, who's going to do what. And, I'm okay, Reverend Josephine is going to do the prayer and Reverend Addison is going to do the song. And I miss singing with my congregation. I miss what it meant to lift our voices in one collective sound with harmony and all of our difference and sameness. I miss that. But when we're home, we sing as a family. So, there's a certain distance that we feel, and this language of lament is a gift to all of us. But then it does force us to the places that we have right now, the things I may have taken for granted. And maybe I did take for granted what it means to disciple my children at home. And the last kind of quirk about Christian Protestantism is there is a bit of a quirk of triumphalism. And I just want to name that out loud because I think it weaves its way into Americanism. That sometimes we rush through the pain and the suffering just to get to the other side. We're going to make it through this. Everything's going to be all right. Don't worry. You're going to get back to school and get back to work. But we do miss something when we jump too quickly to this, triumph and this victory. I do think there's a call to dwell just a little. And I think women do that really well. I think we are physiologically and spiritually equipped to sit with some things and to handle these tensions differently.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can hear from Rori.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on it. There's so much depth to this question, and I think Jewish tradition, and I would never deign to say there's any one Jewish answer to anything, as Malka said, but I think Jewish tradition has really grappled with this question in many ways for centuries, because we have looked at such a long history of Jewish suffering through so many different time periods and developed so much theology around suffering. And for me, I think in my lens of it, so this is just very personal, it's so deeply connected to the human. And what I mean by deeply connected to the human, I think I want to make like a distinction to what Mehnaz, you said, I think of like intrinsic to the human condition, although perhaps that's part of it. But I guess to me, I see a theology in which God has created the world. God has created the world with rules, and God's self is then bound by those rules, right? God respects the rules that God has set out. And part of those rules include free will. Right? What does it mean for us as humans to have the ability to make decisions? And so I think about, like, in this moment of the pandemic, right? We may or may not have had any control over the evolution of these microorganisms. And obviously I'm not a biologist, so you all can criticize my language, right? But right, we might not have had any control, but what we do control is our response to it, right? How do we as a people, what were the structures that we put in place? How did we make sure that people, or not make sure that people were not going to become unhoused as a result of it, that people were going to be cared for, that people were not going to lose their jobs? How did we resolve people's anxieties? Those are all within human power, right? I don't view God as sort of individually choosing, right? This person's going to keep a job and this person is not, right? Those are our choices. We as people then had a chance to look at our budgets and say, right, those of us who are directors, right, I struggle with this, right? What does it mean for me to have a staff that I am responsible for making sure that they can keep their jobs? I am responsible for making sure people can stay at the salary levels that they need to be at, right? All of those are human choices. I keep coming back to, in this moment, there's a teaching in the Talmud in Tractate Bava Kama. It says, once permission is given to the destroyer, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. And the teaching comes in the context, it's really fascinating because it's talking about the Exodus from Egypt. It's talking about the moment of the 10 plagues, and specifically the last plague, right? The Israelites are told that they have to put blood on the doorpost so that the destroyer knows to skip over the houses of the Israelites and only go to the Egyptian houses in slaying the firstborn in the final plague. And the rabbis are sort of confused by this because there's been 9 other plagues in which the Israelites have been spared and the oppressors have been harmed, right? What does it mean that they have to do this? And the Talmud basically jumps in and says, because once you release this into the world, there is no distinguishing between the righteous and the wicked, right? I think about this when we hear people talking about, I'm not going to wear a mask because God's going to protect me, right? I don't have to do this because God will protect me, right? Because I think, right, because once permission, right, once this pandemic is released in the world, it doesn't matter if someone's righteous or wicked. We're all vulnerable, right? But that becomes true also for all forms of suffering, right? Once we release this racism into the world, once this anti-Semitism is released into the world, once this Islamophobia, this transphobia, this homophobia, right, the list can go on. Once we release it into the world, it does not distinguish. And what we've also seen is that when we see these attacks, I find it fascinating, the world that we live in, the interconnectedness, is that we see these racist attacks in which Jews are killed. We see Islamophobic attacks in which Sikhs are killed. We see anti-Semitic attacks in which Christians are killed, right? We live in a world in which we are not living in silos. And so when somebody comes with a gun to the Jewish Community Center in Kansas City to kill Jews, they kill 3 Christians, right? When somebody goes to attack the Holocaust Museum, they kill the Black security guard, right? This is what we're seeing, and these are my personal examples, right? But we all have these examples, right? We are deeply interconnected in this, and we have the power in the world, right? These are all human choices. And so we have the power, just like, right, so this destruction has been released in the world, but how we respond to it. So I want to kind of sit, I guess, simultaneously with, like, I resonate deeply with what Nicole is saying of sitting in this suffering and of leaning into the suffering, and I do think we need to do it more. To me, there's a call to action in that, right? Of what does it then mean, right? I imagine, to the extent that I could visualize God, right? But kind of God looking down, right? People are sort of lamenting and saying, why is this happening? And God lamenting along with us saying, why are you letting this happen, right? People are starving in this world, and we might be the first generation in history that has enough food in the world to feed every person. And it's our choice that we are not actually distributing the food equally, right? We have the capacity to care for people. There's enough wealth in our world. There's enough resources in our world. It is a human choice, right? So God has given us the power to grow food. God has given us the power to do the medical research to at some point find the cure for this disease. And it's going to be a human question of who gets that vaccine? How much is it going to cost? How easily is it going to be distributed? Is it going to be required? Who is protected, right? Those are not God questions. Those are human questions. And I think that right, God has kind of given us everything that we as humans need. And I hear the language of lament, both a human lament, but I really hear it as a godly lament, saying, why have we taken these gifts of God and so distorted and so misused them as to cause more harm or not to alleviate the suffering, right? That lament is joined, a human lament is joined by God's lament of saying, God doesn't want this either, and we have the power to change it.
Vanessa, do you want to weigh in? Yeah.
As a teacher, I have I like a book, a resource. So that was what came to mind for me. There's a book entitled A Troubling in My Soul, Womanist Perspectives of Evil and Suffering. And there's a particular chapter in there that was written by a Black Catholic theologian, M. Sean Copeland, that's entitled Wading Through Sorrows, Wading Through the Sorrows Towards a Theology of Suffering. And one of the things that, in looking at my tradition, my Black Catholic tradition, in the Catholic tradition, we talk about suffering as redemptive, and that our suffering is connected to the Paschal mystery, the suffering, death, and then resurrection of Jesus Christ. In our Black religious tradition, we look at the sense of trouble don't last always, that we admit to the fact we are rooted deep in this suffering right now. There is lament, as Nicole spoke of. That's what our spirituals are. Many of our spirituals were laments. Many of the slave narratives were laments of what it meant to go through this suffering. But in articulating that and speaking it out and not holding it in, and in connecting with community, there was strength that helped you through. I think the challenge now is that in this pandemic, we have to find other ways of being community, other ways of connecting. That one of the things my mother said, I can't wait, my mother's 86 years old, and she says, I can't wait till this pandemic is over so I can hug somebody. You know, that almost brings a tear to my eye, because I don't know when that's going to, really when that will happen, when we can freely hug one another. But there are ways that we can still connect with one another. We can, one of the things that I did just recently is that I had an ice cream social with 4 of my friends from other parts of the country, and we got our ice cream, and we normally have this ritual of getting together during the summer and having ice cream together. We can't do that. So we had our ice cream. That's, that may seem really ridiculous, but there was something in that where I felt connected and they felt connected with each other. And so those are the things we have to check in. Many of our elders, many persons that we know may be living by themselves. This time of pandemic, this time of protests is a time when we need to check in. We need to check in. And that's what we're all called. I mean, and in one sense, we're checking in with each other from our different religious traditions. We're checking in. And that's what we need to do during this time.
In various ways, all of you have touched on a series of tensions: community versus family, the human experience versus the individual experience. This is the thread that I sense is sort of uniting all of your answers. And it brings me to another question that I have, and then we can transition into the Q&A portion of tonight's event. I'm wondering how would you all approach the question of how to prioritize various needs that we're facing, and all of them being urgent in different ways? Family needs, local community needs, needs beyond our community. Is there a way that we could think about how to prioritize these needs when things are coming at us so fast and furious, and there's so much information? I make the mistake of checking CNN.com way too often, and it feels like there's just so much need and it's overwhelming. And of course, there's the need of my 5-year-old right next to me who needs to be fed. And so I want to ask you, how have you thought about prioritizing these various needs as faith leaders, and also as important members of your own family units? So if anybody wants to take up that question, I would be very interested to hear. Okay, Mehnaz?
We're just going alphabetical. No, I'm just kidding. You know, I mean, there are obviously a lot of needs, but I mean, one of the things, and this may sound super naive to everyone here, is that I just can't believe how many people in this country literally live paycheck by paycheck. Like, I'm talking across the board. So when you look at, it's not like I didn't know that, but when you look at the numbers and you look at, you know, the lack of access to their rent, table on the food, I mean, this country is almost nihilistic in the sense that there is no meaning anymore for the human value of life. And I think that need, to me, as naive as I am right now, or feeling, and I'm being very honest, was shocking. And the second thing, and Rori said, we can afford all these things, and I agree with her, is that the lack of health care, the fear of going to the doctor, the fear of going to the doctor, not just going to the doctor, but the fear of it. I know when I was younger, when I didn't have health care, I wouldn't go to the doctor either because no one was going to pick up my bill, right? So, I mean, there are all these different questions that are very practical that are really important. But we, unfortunately, right now have an administration that cannot understand the needs of human people, cannot understand the need of our minority people, cannot understand what poverty is like, because we essentially live in a capitalistic system. And if we're going to live in a capitalistic system, there are going to be these problems. I'm not advocating for communism or socialism, or maybe I'm a little bit of socialism. But what I'm trying to say and make clear to people is that if we want to eradicate these problems of needs and monetary needs, we need to face the consequences as a nation. We cannot do this just individually and say, okay, well, 5% of us are not going to be affected, but 80% will, and 20% won't. So I think that's really a practical kind of feeling that I've had for a long time in this country. But to see the numbers every day and to see lines of people waiting for food and people standing there saying, I have been in this country for 30 years, I've never been on unemployment, and crying, right? Should we do this to our people as people of faith? And one thing I just want to say is that I have to say that the churches, the mosques, the synagogues have done a wonderful job in trying to feed their people. They have set up tents, they have gone out of their way, they have worked with their communities to do that, and not just their own community. They've done that for other people, of other faiths, of other ethnicities. And so there has been this positive sort of community building in the sense of charity. right? This is what I was talking about. Solidarity is charity. You are human. What do you need? We all need something. Thank you.
I'm so, it's so hard to follow Mehnaz because I find you so inspiring. But I'll venture to. So, you know, in the Jewish community, we do have some pretty well-known teachings that address some of these questions, right? We talk about this all the time, that talk about when you have to make a choice between the poor in your own community and the poor of another community, you choose the poor of your community, and so on, right? This idea of like there are kind of spheres of obligation, and they start with the most immediate before they venture out. And I struggle with this. I mean, I think that that's true in many ways, right? I think like at the end of the day, right, like all of us, I love that like many of us have a 5-year-old here, right? So like we all know, like when there's that 5-year-old next to us, like that's going to take priority, you know? Some of you are older also, right? But like there, and I think, you know, for many of us who do this work and who think about it, like there is a difference, right? When it becomes your own family, I think that's a human nature, and I don't think that's something to be ashamed of, right? I think we do prioritize those who are our own. And I think the challenge that I grapple with are a few, right? One becomes, right, kind of how do we define our own? So there's like the immediate, right? There's this person who's living in the house with me, but then how, as I start to go out from, right? So then it gets to like my parents and my aunts and uncles or my great, right? But like how far do we start to extend, right? Who then gets to be part of the outer circles? I think another grappling with it is that there's an assumption, I think, within this teaching that I'm going to take care of my own poor first because you are taking care of your poor, right? So I can prioritize feeding those who are suffering within my synagogue because I know your church is taking care of your people and your mosque is taking care of your people. And what happens when we have gotten to this point within our society where we have such discrepancies between our communities that we have those who are completely lost in the systems, right? Those who don't have any kind of net, right, to catch them, or where we have churches that, or mosques or synagogues that could be so inundated with need, right, that our need could be so disproportionate that at a certain point, those institutions cannot handle the need, whereas other institutions can, right? Like I think this is part of the structures that we've created. And I also really question, when do we start to extend out, right? Like, what does it mean? So I'm going to start, I need to make sure, right? So the classic, put your own mask on before you help somebody else with their oxygen mask, right? When am I okay? This is the question I think I'm sitting with, right? Like none of us are okay. And so when am I okay, right? How much do I need to have in my savings before I feel secure enough to give the rest of my money away, right? Or how much, like, what is my level of security so that I then feel, right? And that's kind of my fear also, is that we've created these structures in society that is so centered around anxiety and mistrust, right? I don't trust that there is someone to catch me in a moment of need. So I need to protect myself. And I need to not just make sure my oxygen mask is on, but I need to have, you know, 3 months of salary in the bank, because if I lose my salary, I don't know how long unemployment will last, right? I mean, we can keep on compounding all of these. And so I don't really have kind of good answers for these. I mean, I think, for me, I think what's really crucial is the recognition that all of our stories are intertwined, right? I think if anything this pandemic is also teaching us, it's that the global is local and the local is global, and something that started overseas in a foreign country that I have never visited is now impacting the people who live immediately next door to me, that nothing is sort of outside of the folds, right? There's nothing that police violence in another city is police violence in my city, right? None of these are isolated incidents from one another. We are all incredibly interconnected, and therefore I am bound to you in that. But how do I balance that feeling of that boundness and that interconnectedness with also my own anxiety in terms of like, what does it mean for me to get to a place of security? And how do I also recognize that I can never be secure? As much salary that I have sort of stored up, or as much, you know, medicines as I keep, or whatever doctors I have on speed dial, or whatever it might be, right? None of that will ever actually be security if the rest of you are not also secure.
Thank you so much. I want to transition into the Q&A portion of our event because we're coming to the end of our hour. I just have to say, you're all amazing and brilliant, and just every line that I'm hearing, I have so many questions, but I'm going to try to not be selfish and ask you all of the questions that I have. And turn it over to our participants. A few of you have sent me private messages with your questions, but I think what I would prefer to do is to see whether any of you want to voice those questions on your own by using your raise hand feature. Alternatively, you can just go like this, because sometimes I forget, and you, some of you might also forget how to use that feature. So you can just do this, or you could click raise hand, and then my colleague from CTU, Peter Cunningham, will unmute you, and you can ask the panelists a question. You can direct it towards someone specific or not, as you choose. So let's take a couple questions before we wrap up. And if I don't see any hands raised, then I will draw from those that were sent to me. Anybody? Okay, so I'm going to read a question that I was sent. Okay, this is, hold on one second, I have a few. Okay, so this question comes from Alan Richard, and it reads, a central element of a crisis theology is that a moment of crisis is a moment of decision. What decision or decisions does this moment ask us to make? Which I thought is a really interesting question. Yeah. So anybody, feel free to jump in, anyone on the panel.
Okay, I'm going to just say something regarding decision making. I truly believe in the power of discernment. So for me, I would need to bring whatever this is as a person of faith. I need to sit with this in prayer. And I think of the fact that within our, in the Black spiritual tradition, that our spirituality, that being immersed in that deep contemplative and charismatic experience of prayer has been instrumental in giving Black people the spiritual and cultural elements to liberate themselves from their internal tyrannies that sequester the soul and destroy the mind. These are not my words. These are the words of Carlyle Fielding Stewart in the book Soul Survivors. And so I would say that I could not immediately tell you this is what we need to do. I do say that this is a time that people of faith need to be in prayer, need to be in discernment, and really take that seriously. We live in a society that wants answers quick, that wants it yesterday. And this may not be that type of an experience where we can make quick responses. We may need to sit with it for a moment and pray on it. And then out of that will emerge the strength and the clarity to do the work that needs to be done. And also, hopefully, to work as allies with one another, because I think this is a time we're being called to come together. I truly believe in the power of women to come together as allies and to birth movements for the common good. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Was that Mehnaz? Who?
Yeah, Mehnaz, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have any provincial answers here or providential answers, but I think that we need renewal. And we need renewal in terms of facing the truth. And this goes back and connects with this whole idea of suffering and leaning on. Because I think that we are still dilly-dallying, walking around, patching up wounds, whether it's about our healthcare system, about poverty, about our Black brothers and sisters in this country. There is still the Band-Aid, but there is no truth, right? There is no vaccine. So I think one of the things that we can do in terms of the crisis of theology is say we may be needing a renewal of our faith in America. and the way that faith functions in America, because in America, we actually have religious freedom. We don't have religious freedom in Europe. We don't have multi-religious freedom in most Muslim countries. So one of the things that we can do is take this moment and think about, how do we think of our theology together with a new kind of humanism that was supposed to be America, right? So I think there's two things we can do. One is to face the truth, which is the hardest thing to do. Two is look within our communities and say, how can we renew ourselves? How can we help each other? And three, and then extend out in charity and solidarity towards other faiths. I think there are ways and strategies of doing it. We obviously don't have the leadership in this country. And perhaps, you know, going back to the 50s and 60s, we may want to think about the religious leadership that we used to have, right? That we used to have that was not splintered, right? So we can look at even Abraham Heschel, we can look at Martin Luther King, we can even look at Al-Din of the Nation of Islam. They were leaders, regardless of how you feel about them, what you think about them. They were leaders that were at the forefront. There were Catholic white priests that were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, right? I mean, we think of Catholics as white because we look at Rome, but Catholic is also South American and African and Asian, right? We have to turn our gaze and understand that Christianity is not just white, that Judaism is not just white, that Islam is not just white. So we have to renew our thinking, our theology. We have to make those connections internally and externally with each other.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think out of respect to everybody who's called into this wonderful event, we have to bring the evening to a close. I so hope that we can have a part two, because I feel like we just touched the surface of these very deep and important questions. I just want to offer the panel one opportunity to wrap up and say a few words if they want. And then I think we're going to have to bring it to a close. And I say that regretfully again, because I am getting so many fabulous questions from you. And I appreciate everybody's patience. So now I'm going to once again turn it to the panel for closing remarks, optional closing remarks, and then we'll say goodbye. Thank you. Nicole? Oh, sorry, Vanessa, you want to get us started?
Oh, I was going to speak about some hopes I have.
Oh, yes.
Since after I've been listening. After listening tonight, I have hope in listening to our dynamic speakers. I really have been honored to be a part of this gathering. I have hope that our hearts and our minds will begin to be open and transformed, and that in working together, those systems of institutionalized oppression will be dismantled. And finally, I have hope that this movement, that this time of gathering of prophetic action on behalf of justice will be rooted in love. I truly believe, and I know deep down in my soul, that a change is going to come.
Thank you. It's so beautiful. Thank you. Nicole, I saw that you
Yeah, I'm so encouraged by this conversation, and I'm reminded that having a background of faith can enable us to unite in ways that we could have never done in any other way, and also drives us toward this hope that Vanessa just talked about. I too am hopeful, and I'm actually really encouraged because this season has been a time of deep isolation, but conversations like these remind us that none of us are alone, that no one's burden is their own burden, and no question is just pertinent to one faith or one person. So I've so appreciated sharing in this conversation, and I really hope that those who have joined will continue to cross some boundaries, whatever they perceive as boundaries, and find some commonalities so that we can really use this time to make some important decisions, as that question kind of suggested, to make some decisions about who we're going to be in this time in ways that hopefully our 5-year-olds will look back and be grateful and say, I'm glad that you did that.
I just want to add my own appreciation for all of the voices that are here and all of you who joined us. And also just my own inspiration that comes from all of you. And I think really just sitting deeply with the ways in which our own stories actually make us bigger, right? Make us part of some grander narrative. And I think that's a lot of what I'm sitting with, that we're oftentimes in moments of crisis, we turn inward and we turn to our particulars. And in this, I think we can see our particulars as a way to actually connect us to something so much bigger. And it's not something that erases our particulars, but something that, right, through our deep faith, suddenly we can be having this conversation. And I'm echoing both the hope that Vanessa said, and I think the question that Nicole is challenging us with of who do we want to be in this moment? And there's a huge amount of power and privilege that comes with the fact that we get to be the decisors of that, right? We get to write the history of this moment. We get to tell the story of who our children say, who we became in this moment. And that's not a responsibility that any of us should take lightly. That's all of our responsibilities in this moment.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much because I did already, but I just really want to thank you, Malka. This is such a wonderful idea, and you guys are all very inspirational. And thank you for everyone to attend. But I just want to leave you with a thought. So I was reading, Toni Morrison's little book on literature, Players in the Dark, and in that she says something that's really poignant, and it also goes back to my history with philosophy and critical theory. We are always becoming. We're always in the process of becoming. And I think we have to be very careful about, the fact that we are just being, but we are always evolving, always becoming, because you know what? Maybe our future doesn't want to have what we're leaving with them. So things change and transform. So my hope is that we will always be transforming, always becoming, always evolving, always creating, and always loving. Thank you.
Thank you again to our incredible panelists. I can't tell you how many people are private messaging me and also sending to the group that they're already ready for a part 2. So everybody, I'm going to have to work on convincing these amazing women to join us again. And I'll close by saying I hope that we can harness the energy and the learning from tonight's event to work on making positive change in our own communities, in our families, in the world. And all of you give me a great amount of hope. And I just thank you so much for being here tonight. So we're going to end the event, but hopefully we'll have another meeting again sometime soon in better times. Thank you so much.